Hello, and welcome to American Amnesia. I am Cliff Garner, your host, and I've been working with Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy by Christopher Lasch. Looked at the first half, or actually a little bit more than half, of Chapter 4, which is Does Democracy Deserve to Survive? And of course, I had after posting on Facebook, I had a couple say, "Well, our country isn't a democracy; it's a constitutional republic." Well, yes, I know that, and I think Christopher Lasch knew that also. The issue isn't whether or not this country is a republic, but whether or not the democratic component of the republic should remain in place, which is namely that of the average person voting. That does put a different spin on it. So when it comes to the low-hanging fruit people, pick a little higher. Not only that, one person was more concerned about getting a quick basically a cheap shot and running away. My friend Billy, on the other hand, and I'm sorry, Billy, if I went after you a little hard. Just the other guy was just a bit of in my opinion, a bit of a jerk, and it's, yes, I know. The words weren't mine, actually. They were Lash's. That's why that is in the title, and will be in the title in this episode, or this installment, however you want to put it. But again, the issue isn't whether or not this country is a democracy or a republic. It's a democratic republic. And yes, it is bound by a constitution. And we could go down to the bicameral legislative branch or whatever. We want to get persnickety about things. Okay, fine. We can. And as far as it goes, yeah, it's a republic. I rather like it being a republic. I think that I have come to rather admire the work that the founding fathers did. As the older I get, the more I admire it. The thing is that how we define it is less important as to being aware of what it is. And I don't generally subscribe to lazy thinking, and I kind of resent it when people accuse me of doing that. Especially for a real cheap victory. It'd be one thing if there was something really at stake there. Cheap shots are cheap shots. So, but at any rate, I will continue here on the issue, and this work is actually quite remarkable, and this is why I'm continuing to present this to you. I think it's an important work. I think that what Lasch did as a life work is just incredibly remarkable. And the fact is that he never, I shouldn't say never, he was always developing his ideas further and further. And he went from being essentially a Marxist to embracing a much more conservative vision. But I don't know that you would call him a conservative, and I definitely wouldn't call him a communist. And he never entirely forsook Marx as a point of intellectual reference. The thing about Marx, a lot of people often misconstrue, comes from the Hegelian dialectic, and the dialectic is a valid theoretical framework, a thesis in confrontation with its antithesis, and the clash therefrom, and will present a resulting synthesis of the two. That the two aren't entirely eliminated. I mean, they're modified into a third concept, conceptual basis, or framework, presenting the new thesis. So that said, a lot of people want to find something more sinister in it than is there. And they talk about how the New World Order continually does that. Well, maybe they do, but the thing is that this is conceptually correct. I mean, that you do have this process in place, that this is the way things work at some level, and it's even a practical framework. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, when you have two conflicting, and not necessarily opposite, but they don't entirely jive. Two ideas that come up against each other in a situation, that there's going to be some kind of a give and take in the process that produces something different. This happens in relationships between two people. That there is going to be this confrontation. It doesn't have to even be hostile. Now for Marx was basically he was basically looking to create a revolutionary order, and that's why he went about it the way he went about it. But he the Hegelian dialectic isn't necessarily conflict. It doesn't have to be. It can even be cooperative. So the slandering of the dialectic is not exactly valid. It describes a process that's actually common to most functional processes. I mean, it just works out that way. So that I don't find that a bad thing, and I don't think Lasch did either. I think that as he developed his ideas and continued to develop personally, that he held on to what he knew to be correct. I mean, he dealt with facts. That's part of being a professor, You want to teach your students well. You don't want to teach them poorly. So I see why he did what he did, and I can see how he did it. The fact is that you don't have to buy into Marxian economics to hold on to certain concepts. And he really wasn't really a Marxist so much as he was a person who really read from a very wide range of people and influences. the degree to which he was a scholar of the transcendentalists, the whole circle with Emerson is in and of itself interesting. And like I say, I as a younger person, when I was researching socialism, I really found Orestes Brownson particularly interesting. And Brownson, well, he never exactly gave up on socialism in itself. I'm not a socialist anymore. I used to be one, but I respect Brownson. Brownson's position was this: he was before Marx. I mean, he was what Marx would have called a utopian, and so was Emerson. But Brownson actually said of himself, as his religious beliefs got more conservative, that his politics became more radical. And that's probably not exactly true, but it is kind of funny because he went from being a Presbyterian to a Universalist to a Unitarian to an atheist to a Catholic. And when he became a Catholic, which most of his life he ended up being a Catholic, he never quite went to unbridled capitalism. He never went that far. He always saw some kind of a social / socialist, maybe communal type of viewpoint. And so he was always informed by this kind of a socialistic economic belief. And he was as American as apple pie, actually. Totally homegrown and very American. We can make other arguments about W.E.B. Du Bois, but Du Bois also sought to be that way, at least. He was hoping to get away from European kind of influences, but he still got, I think, caught up in them pretty heavily himself. Particularly, oddly enough, the Nazis. For Du Bois, interestingly, one of the foremost black authors of the Harlem Renaissance. Fascinating fellow himself. Another person I researched quite a bit. So, at any rate, but Lasch's interest in Brownson and the Transcendentalists is something that I'm particularly intrigued by, and I'm reading more and more of it. I'm catching more about Lasch's work as I go along, and my regard for him just grows. He's a very remarkable mind. So I left off at page 86 in the chapter, Does Democracy Deserve to Survive? And I'm going to finish this chapter. I'm not going to read any other chapters from the book in their entirety. But I do want to lay the groundwork, because this is where he frames his question that he answers with the ideas of communitarianism and populism as the suggested framework for the future to maintain our republic and to maintain the character of the republic as it was probably intended in the first place. And at least, if not the way it was intended at the beginning, at least to maintain it as it was perceived by such people as de Tocqueville and the more egalitarian framework that we had and to maintain that, as opposed to going into some kind of a, highly elitist type mechanism that actually what we've had of late has gotten kind of out of control. Now there, I'll go into Diane Ziegler and some of the ideas that they have. I do have a copy of at least one, probably two or three, of the Irony of Democracy, and I'll dig some up and go over some of the main concepts in those too, just to show what the elites are and where they fit in and everything else. Also, maybe some Peter Drucker. So at any rate, this starts on page 86 here, and we're framing the question: does the democracy, which means the average person's input into the system, deserve to survive? It isn't simply a question of whether democracy can survive. That alone is enough to give a new urgency to the issues we have always been eager to avoid. But the deeper question, of course, is whether democracy deserves to survive. For all its intrinsic attractions, democracy is not an end in itself. I'll repeat that. Democracy is not an end in itself. It's leading to someplace else, right? It has to be judged by its success in producing superior goods, superior works of art, and learning, and a superior type of character. So what he's saying is that in and of itself, this leveling of equality of itself is not the end. The idea of us participating within the government equally is not of itself the end. The end has to be to produce something greater than otherwise would be done. That's quite an order, but it's a valid thing to put on any political system. And that's the way we should see that. If it isn't producing something superior, a superior culture, a superior product, right? The produce of the nation. If it isn't producing better people, then we have to come back and say that maybe it isn't a valid form, regardless of what it is. And to validate power given to anybody or any group or people or whatever, a class or a group of people, to run a country and not to achieve something along those lines does not validate their use of power. Fairness in and of itself, equality in and of itself, is not the end. It's a means. Democracy can never prove itself beyond cavil. Walt Whitman wrote in Democratic Virtues, until it founds and luxuriously grows its own forms of art, its own religious and moral character, the perfect personalities that will make our Western world a nationality superior to any hither known. That's a big order. Superior. The test of democracy, Whitman thought, was whether it could produce an aggregate of heroes, characters, exploits, sufferings, prosperity or misfortune, glory or disgrace, common to all, typical of all. Wow. For those who cherish the ideal of the open mind, even if it turns out to be an empty mind. Open mind, empty mind. Not necessarily the one and the same. Thank God for that. You can be open-minded and have your mind filled. That's a good way to be. But to have an open mind and nothing in it is very sad. Boy, you're just waiting for somebody to stuff something in there. This talk of heroes. Okay, now let me back it up. For those who cherish the ideal of the open mind, even if it turns out to be an empty mind, this talk of heroes, exploits, glory, and disgrace is automatically suspect. Frightening, in fact. The call for models of heroism common to all seems to threaten the pluralism of the ethical commitments that democracy is obliged to protect. Really? In the absence of common standards, however, tolerance becomes indifference, and cultural pluralism degenerates into an aesthetic spectacle in which the curious folkways of our neighbors are savored with the relish of the connoisseur. Moldy-coldy here. However, our neighbors themselves as individuals are never held up to any kind of judgment. We've heard this before. The suspension of ethical judgment in the conception or misconception of pluralism, now current, makes it inappropriate to speak of ethical commitments at all. Aesthetic appreciation is all that can be achieved under current definitions of cultural diversity. See, that's the thing about the really shallow concept of diversity that we've gotten with the so-called multiculturalism. Multiculturalism promises to be a very enriching kind of experience, but as it is, it's actually a very superficial concept as it's actually played out. And what happens is that it's everything is treated as equal. Well, they're not. All things are not equal. Some things are better than others, and that we are able to even conceive of a multicultural experience within our culture in the West, I think puts us on a higher standard than cultures that would not be able to do that. But it also does call into question, to what degree must we be influenced by all cultures without sacrificing our own? That is a question that we really do have to come to eventually. And it does require judgment sooner or later. The questions that allegedly divide us beyond hope of compromise turn out to be lifestyle questions in the jargon of the day, right? How should I dress? What should I eat? Whom should I marry? Whom should I take as my friends? In this context, the question that really matters, how shall I live, also becomes a matter of taste, of idiosyncratic personal preference, at best of religious or ethnic identification. And really, those things of religious and ethnic identification actually suffer as a rule because it all becomes a matter of taste. And that tends to trivialize more serious differences. On the other hand, when you are existing only under an identity, and this is the opposite sin, then these conflicts of identities come into question, and also at what level is it the identity is significant as opposed to the legal framework? Are persons to be regarded, or is law to be regarded? And this does become an issue very often when we've seen how these things develop, and I think Lasch deals with that to a certain extent. as well. I'm just bringing the question up. Back to the rock. But this deeper and more difficult question, rightly understood, requires us to speak of impersonal virtues like fortitude, workmanship, moral courage, honesty, and respect for adversaries. And that's really that respect for adversaries needs to be a thing that is guarded and protected and nurtured. We don't have that dialogue now in the U.S. It needs to be cultivated. It needs to be recultivated, replanted, because right now it seems like perhaps it may not be existent at all. If we believe in these things, moreover, moral courage, honesty, all that, we must be prepared to recommend them to everyone as the moral preconditions of a good life. What we're talking about is rebinding the undergirdings that produce good citizenship. Because we've lost that. That is gone. It's lost. To refer everything to a plurality of ethical commitments means that we make no demands on anyone and acknowledge no one's right to make demands on to make any demands on ourselves. No responsibility. That can't be done. We have to have skin in the game. We have to be responsible. Or, consequently, we are not citizens. The suspension of judgment logically condemns us to solitude. So if we are not in that position, then we are not part of the process. Unless we are prepared to make demands on one another, we can only enjoy the most rudimentary kind of common life. Right? Even if we can't agree on the definition of a good life, and it could be argued that we have not yet seriously made the effort, we can surely agree on minimal standards of workmanship, literacy, and general competence. And again, competence, that ability and knowledge. That is a good thing, and that is something that we should expect from our fellow citizens, actually. Without these, we can have no basis on which either to demand respect or to grant it. Populism is based on respect. Okay. Common standards are absolutely indispensable to a democratic society. Societies organized around a hierarchy of privilege can afford multiple standards, but a democracy cannot. Double standards mean second-class citizenship. If you are going to apply a lower standard to one group of people, then they become second-class citizens. That is what you, my dear pseudo-left friends, have done to minorities. And that's why I think you keep speaking for them. Must be really nice to have so much power over somebody. I am speaking sarcastically. The recognition of equal rights is a necessary but insufficient condition of democratic citizenship. Unless everyone has equal access to the means of competence, as we might speak of them, equal rights will not confer self-respect. Self-respect is a good place to start. That is why it is a mistake to base the defense of democracy on the sentimental fiction that all people are alike. In fact, people are not alike in their capacities. This, of course, does not prevent us from imaginatively entering the lives of others. Walk a mile in her shoes. As Hannah Arendt has pointed out, the Enlightenment got it backwards. It is citizenship that confers equality, not equality that creates a right to citizenship. You heard that. It is citizenship that confers equality, not equality that creates a right to citizenship. So just because a person is sitting here in the U.S. doesn't mean they're automatically equal. Not as a citizen. Sameness is not equality, and political equality, therefore, is the very opposite of equality before death. Arendt says, or of equality before God. Political equality, citizenship, equalizes people who are otherwise unequal in their capacities, and the universalization of citizenship therefore has to be accompanied not only by formal training in the civic arts, but by measures designed to assure the broadest distribution of economic and political responsibility, the exercise of which is even more important than formal training in teaching good judgment, clear and cogent speech, the capacity for decision, and the willingness to accept the consequences of our actions. It is in this sense that universal citizenship implies a whole world of heroes. So if you're going to talk about this world citizenship, and you're afraid of that whole idea of those heroes just within the framework of the U.S., if you're going to talk about the whole world, and you're going to talk about actually giving people a real equality, it's going to take a whole lot more. You're putting the horse behind the wagon. You're getting it backwards. Democracy requires such a world of citizenship as not to become an empty formality. And if you're going to treat world citizenship the way you have U.S. citizenship, then that's all it is. It's a pathetic vision. It's unworthy. It's unworthy and it's not livable. Who are you? Democracy also requires a more invigorating ethic than tolerance. Tolerance is a fine thing, but it is only the beginning of democracy, not its destination. In our time, democracy is more seriously threatened by indifference than by intolerance or superstition. Well, you know, that tolerance often is indifference. You just don't care. Not telling you what to do. But indifference is quite a different thing. And they kind of look the same in some cases, but they're not the same thing. You don't care. We have become too proficient in making excuses for ourselves, or worse, in making excuses for the disadvantaged. This was written in 1994 and published in 1995. It's still valid. We are so busy defending our rights conferred for the most part by judicial decree, that we give little thought for our responsibilities. We seldom say what we think for fear of giving offense. 1994. We are determined to respect everyone, but we have forgotten that respect has to be earned. Something we need to remember there. Respect is not another word for tolerance or appreciation of an alternative lifestyle or community. This is a tourist approach to morality. Respect is what we experience in the presence of admirable achievements, admirably formed characters, natural gifts put to use. Yeah. Admire. Look up to. Respect. It entails the exercise of discriminating judgment, not indiscriminate acceptance. Quite a difference. Our society labors in the grip of two great paralyzing fears: fanaticism and racial warfare. Having belatedly discovered the contingency of all belief systems and ideologies, we are obsessed with the terrors that arise when partial truths are taken as universal. In a century dominated by fascism and communism, which the 20th century was, this fear is understandable. But by this time, it is surely possible to argue without being accused of complacency that the totalitarian menace is receding. And this is something that might actually be invalid, because we see it coming back up here in the U.S. and in the West. And the EU is a good example of a totalitarianism that is actually running rampant. And over here, it potentially could as well. Nor is Islamic fundamentalism an equivalent danger, as we are often told. It's growing. Those who worry over much about ideological fanaticism often fall into a complacency of their own, which we especially see in liberal intellectuals. And that is true. It is as if they alone understood the danger of misplaced universality, the relativity of truth, the need for suspended judgment. They see themselves, these devoutly open-minded intellectuals, as a civilized minority in a sea of fanaticism. Well, priding themselves on their emancipation from religion, they misunderstand religion as a set of definitive, absolute dogmas resistant to any kind of intelligent appraisal. They miss the discipline against fanaticism in religion itself. The quest for certainty, as Dewey called it, is nowhere condemned with such relentless passion as in the prophetic tradition common to Judaism and Christianity, which warns again and again against idolatry, the idolatry of the church included. And speaking to power. Many intellectuals assume that religion satisfies a need for moral and emotional security, a notion that even a passing knowledge of religion would dispel. There are limits, it seems, even to the openness of the open mind, limits quickly revealed when the conversation turns to religion. The problem of racial intolerance is closely linked to fanaticism. Here again, there's a good deal of complacency and self-righteousness mixed up in the fear of intolerance. The thinking classes seem to labor under the delusion that they alone have overcome racial prejudice. That's why they're so often so condescending. The rest of the country, in their view, remains incorrigibly racist. Their eagerness to drag every conversation back to race is enough in itself to invite the suspicion that their investment in this issue exceeds anything that is justified by the actual state of race relations. To be overly concerned with any type of subject means that you're probably obsessed by it. So a person who is obsessed by race is probably, more than likely, racist. If it's your main concern, think about it. Monomania is not a sign of good judgment. But whether it springs from self-righteousness or panic of a mixture of the two, the assumption that most Americans remain racist at heart cannot stand up to close examination, even cursory examination. The improvement of racial attitudes is one of the few positive developments in recent decades. Well, and he didn't live to see Obama and what would happen there. We have. And we have seen what's happened there. And it's exactly this type of thing in which where the main concern being race has undermined race relations. And then when we think about what sane people keep saying over and over again, what is his name? Morgan Freeman saying that, what if we don't talk about it? You don't think of me as a black man, and I won't think of you as a white man. Isn't that the way it should be? That we see past that. But we have so many on the left, and I call it pseudo-left, because that's really where the problem is. I think the people that are truly on the left actually recognize that the problem can be addressed and worked out. But that they say that this is not the thing to do. That what Martin Luther King was talking about is the quality of a person's character being more important than the color of their skin is not the way we should see it. All white people are racist. This attitude is poor. And it does nothing whatsoever to improve things. That is the biggest setback that has occurred in race relations in my whole life. And I saw some of the things going on with civil rights. Not a whole lot. I was young. But I saw some of it. And this has been shameful. Not that racial conflict has subsided, but it is a serious mistake to interpret every conflict as evidence of the retrograde outlook of ordinary Americans, as a revival of the historic intolerance that has played so large a part in our country's history. The new racism is reactive rather than residual, let alone resurgent. It is a response, however inappropriate and offensive, to a double standard of racial justice that strikes most Americans as unreasonable and unfair. Since most opposition to affirmative double standard is routinely dismissed as racist, one reaction to this insult from working and lower class middle class people harassed by affirmative action and busing, and now from college students harassed by attempts to enforce politically correct language and thought, is to accept racism as a badge of honor. You see where that goes. It's not good. And it's precisely because of this politically correct idiocy of the SJWs. Stop it. You people are destructive. It is a badge of honor to flaunt it with studied provocation in the face of those who want to make racism and minority rights the only subject of public discussion. Like I say, SJWs really got it wrong. It's going to come down on you, too. From the point of view of people who are single-mindedly obsessed with racism and ideological fanaticism, democracy can only mean one thing: the defense of what they call cultural diversity. But there are far more important issues confronting friends of democracy. This crisis of competence, the spread of apathy, and a suffocating cynicism. The moral paralysis of those who value openness above all. In the 1870s, Walt Whitman wrote, "Never was there perhaps more hollowness at heart than present and here in the United States. Genuine belief seems to have left us." Those words are as timely as ever. When will we be ready to listen to them? And he brings up populism as the main concept to answer the question about should democracy survive. He says yes. And it's by respect. Respect of one another as citizens. Doesn't matter our color. Doesn't matter. Anything else doesn't matter. That we are to respect each other as human beings and as equals, as citizens. We can't be expected to respect everybody inside the country as a citizen. There comes a lifting of everything when we can have an established basis for dealing with each other. That we have a unifying ethos. He also brings up communitarianism. And for good reason, because it is not necessarily an antithesis of populism, but it is another idea that is based on, actually it's based on compassion, but it also, with the undergirding of respect, it becomes something a little more fulfilling than the welfare state itself. Not that we should get rid of the welfare state necessarily tomorrow. Personally, I rather like the welfare state for the most part. But there are aspects of it that have been destructive. And in order to confront the abuses and confront the problems that undergird that, or have not undergird it, but the problems that have actually caused the breakdown of the welfare state, need to be addressed and fixed. And in order to do that, we need to start somewhere. And I think it's interesting that and I've heard people say that Trump is the message, not the messenger. Had he been the messenger, there would be an even stronger message. And I think that that's a good way to put it. I think that he is the message from the people. It's time. It's time for change. It's time for us to come back and look at each other as Americans and learn to respect one another again. The system, the way it has been going, with this globalist vision and this politically correct lunacy, actually, I think it's pretty much run its course. And much more of either one, not to mention both, I think will be destructive. I think we see that. This is the message. Populism. Let's start with building with basic respect. Then we can work on the compassion part a little bit better and be in a better position to do that. And I think that's really what Lasch is driving towards. And I'll come back to these ideas. So that I'm going to bring in some other things, and I'll probably work a little bit more with some more of the news. I wanted to get a good framework in place of what I'm trying to bring to your attention. And this working with Lasch and going into the great sellout and also talking about the new paradigm and things. I think these are setting the framework for what I want you to start to see and to build a dialogue. There's a lot more that's coming, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But that framework, I think I now have in place. Until next time.